Welcome back to Media 7. The year 1981 is regarded as a traumatic one in New Zealand political history, marked by a controversial election and a sporting tour that split the nation. We tend to forget that it was also the year that the Muldoon government introduced a law that set the international standard for government transparency, the Official Information Act. The new Act, passed the following year, repealed the Official Secrets Act of 1951 and, in so doing, upended old assumptions about what we could know about government. Secrets we shouldn't know became information we should. The language of the Act focused on its use by members of the public. Anyone could make a request, but very few of us have, largely because we don't know how. Simon Pound has a video tutorial.
It hasn't always been that you could trust what your government told you. This old US public information film advised you to duck and cover in the event of a nuclear attack.
We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it, just as we are ready for many other dangers that are around us all the time.
By ducking and covering in the face of nuclear Armageddon, you would stand about the same chance as a snowball in hell. Or, in a local angle, you'd last about as long as Paul Henry in a dark alley full of hirsute ladies.
But while you couldn't question the official line then, these days our government is eminently more helpful. In fact, Robert Muldoon's National Party passed a revolutionary bill that means that New Zealand has some of the freest information laws in the world. The Official Information Act, 1982, starts out with a very clear principle of availability.
That information shall be made available unless there is good reason for withholding it. All government information is bound by this, whether from ministers, ministries, state-owned enterprises, schools, hospitals, police. Every bit of government has to give you information you request.
Unless there is that good reason not to. These may include
national security, international relations, economic damage, privacy, safety, and not getting in the way of officials being able to occasionally say what they actually think.
However, these reasons must be balanced against the public interest. Any New Zealander or New Zealand company can easily make a request under the Act by following these simple steps.
Step 1. Work out who you need to ask. The Ministry of Justice has a directory of official information. This sets out every organisation subject to the Act. It lists what they do, what documents they hold, and includes a list of the ministers responsible. Step 2. Work out what you want to ask. Be specific and clear. A clear request is less easily ducked. Step 3. Simply make contact.
You can either call them on the telephone or go and see them in person, although for certainty it's generally best to put things in writing.
In many cases, contacting the minister concerned may be easiest, and always keep a record of your request.
Under the Act, requests must be returned in 20 working days, and if you have a large request, a reasonable charge may be levied.
But what if the answer you get isn't what you'd hoped for? Well, you still have avenues. Sometimes your answer may have been impacted by some of those good reasons, and sometimes sensitive information will be redacted.
If you feel the reasons for withholding information are bunkum, or that there is too much black lining, you can make a complaint to the Ombudsman.
The Ombudsman is kind of like a referee who makes sure the government plays fair. And if they agree with you, they can take your case up with the government.
So, this really is an amazing piece of law. It actually sets out to
promote the accountability of ministers of the Crown and government officials.
And when used correctly, that's exactly what it does. So, get using it, friends. And remember, if a nuclear bomb does go off, you're stuffed, whatever you do.
Simon Pound there. Joining us now to discuss the Act and how it's actually working are author and researcher Nicky Hager, whose career has been all about what he believes we ought to know. Dominion Post Chief Reporter Hayden Dews, who has fought his own battles to get information under the Act, and PSA National Secretary Brenda Pilot, who represents the people who expedite what is sometimes a torrent of requests. Welcome to you all. Nicky, 3 or 4 years ago, Stephen Price delivered a paper on the OIA, and he talked to you among other people, and he observed that the people who used the Act most frequently were, in his words, deeply ambivalent about it. Would that be a fair description of your feelings about the Act?
No, I should start with the good news really, which is that most people who use the Act, who are normal people who are writing for their grandfather's military records or writing to social welfare or whatever it is, most people get a good deal out of it and get the information they want reasonably promptly, and the public servants help them. The problems begin when people are trying to get political information, embarrassing things, information the government doesn't want to let out. And then those of us who do that find that suddenly the 20 working days becomes 40, 60, 80. We get told that the information has, as we just saw on the little program, is national security or economically has to be withheld. And then you can get into huge fights where if there's something which is really controversial, you're never going to get it.
So it's not just inefficiency in these agencies, it's deliberate obstruction.
Sometimes it's inefficiency. I think that sometimes they just need more resources and the people being better trained. But actually, no. There are senior officials and there are particularly people in the beehive whose job it is to look at the information and say, is this embarrassing? And you've got this terrible conflict of interest that it's their job to release it, but they're the ones who are going to cop it or be embarrassed or be sorry that this particular information gets out. And in those cases, it's very hard to get.
Was there a time when it either got better or worse? You know, you've been using it for a long time, the Act, haven't you? Yeah,
in its first years in the 80s, there was a special organisation which trained people inside the departments. I think it picked up, the spirit of it was being promoted by the government. And then by the 80s, it started to dip down again. The person who can really take the credit for that is Murray McCully, who in the 1990s set up a special unit within the national government where he vetted all the official information requests that might hurt them and figured out ways to stop them. Went on to Labour in the last 9 years, where they took over where he'd left off, and where they didn't want information to come out, they were pretty good at stopping it. And so someone like me, I might spend months getting some information. I once had one where I was trying to find out about East Timor in 1975. It was hardly sensitive, but I worked for about 9 months through the Act, dealt with the people in Foreign Affairs. They said they were going to give it to me, and then it got bumped up to the beehive level, and suddenly it was delayed longer. And one day, I found out that they had taken the information they were going to give me, and the PR people had decided, we don't know what he wants it for, might be bad news, so they gave it to all the parliamentary journalists before they mailed it to me. So they ruined my months of work. In other words, the PR people got in on the act of, thwarting my efforts.
Is that kind of like the last resort? They spoil your scoop. I mean, that must have happened to you, Hayden.
It does, and it happens quite regularly. And it's not just that, but it's the stonewalling that you get from a vast army of PR specialists that are there to prevent you from getting
Many of them former journalists.
Correct, and we run into them all the time, and it's nice to see them, but they've got a job to do. They get paid well to do it, and I mean, we look at the number. There was a cabinet paper out 2 weeks ago that talked about the number of frontline staff that they're going to put a cap on. It talked about spin doctors. There were 320 working in our major departments, and that excludes some things like police. You know, Department of Labour itself had 25, and that's about the size of our general news staff, excluding features and sport, etc. It's a tough battle, and they've got the numbers.
If those comms jobs do go, do you expect any change in the way you can make requests, or will it just be business as usual?
Not strictly, because I think Nicky raised the point, it's not them who are pulling the strings, it's the people further up the line. And if they decide that they don't want information to get out, then our job is incredibly tough to get that. Unless we've got deep throats or sources very close that we know exactly what we're looking for and it's there, they can get away with it. And you almost need a law degree to be able to write a OIA request tight enough so it doesn't have holes in it. It seems
like that's absolutely crucial. You need the source so you know what you're looking for in the first place. That helps a lot with getting your result.
It does, and there's some information which you're never going to get under the official information, or you will, no, that's not true, that you will rarely get. Sometimes the Ombudsman intervenes and they work wonders, but most often, if you're in our kind of shoes, it's better to go and get an inside source who will leak you something, because otherwise chances are the story will never ever come out.
Now, there is, of course, another perspective on this, and that's what I'll ask you about, Brenda. I've spoken to civil servants, as I have no doubt you have, who feel that the OIA is the bane of their lives and that they are deluged and can't do their jobs because they're responding to frivolous OIA requests, often from opposition MPs. How much of a problem is that?
Well, there's certainly a lot of Official Information Act requests that come from opposition research units, opposition members of Parliament, large numbers actually, and if you add that to the things like parliamentary questions, which have also increased in their volume and the sort of the trawling that goes on through them, and you've got some real difficulties in resourcing for departments. The job of dealing with Official Information Act requests actually encompasses quite a lot of different public servants. The people who are doing, if you like, the frontline work are often relatively junior, not necessarily well paid, but as requests increase in their potential risk, for example, if I were in a department and I saw an Official Information request coming from Nikki, we'd probably pay quite a bit of attention to it.
Right, and the alarm bells would go off.
That's right, the alarm bells go off and the senior managers begin to look at them. The Minister's office will increasingly become involved in
this
that.
is a key point, isn't it? Is that there will be a point where the Minister's office becomes involved. Does that also mean that your poor civil servant becomes the meat in the sandwich there?
Well, public servants who are dealing with things are dealing with quite a complex matrix of interests, really. They're aware, because if they're dealing with this stuff, they've been trained in what the Official Information Act is about. So they've had the training, and they've usually got an instruction book that tells you what you're meant to do. So that's part of the story. But they're also dealing with their department, which will have, if it's a typical government department, quite a risk-averse approach to life in general, including Official Information Act requests. And then, of course, you're dealing with ministers and ministers' advisors who have political management high on their radar. So the public servant is trying to weigh up all of these interests, and of course the law, the Official Information Act, should, and in many cases I'm sure does take precedence. But the reality for public servants is that your department and your chief executive's interests and your minister's interests also weigh pretty heavily. So they're juggling all of that stuff. And of course, you've sometimes got some pretty senior and some pretty, robust people who are, scrutinising the work you're doing. And there's nothing like getting a huge Official Information Act request that covers a wide range of possible answers, boxes and boxes of information that you've got to go through to try and make sense of. It's a very difficult task.
Who do those big ones come from?
Well, they can come from all kinds of people. Typically, the requests you get from members of the public who want to know about, as Nikki said, their grandfather's war record. Those are usually pretty straightforward. The ones that are the kind of fishing expeditions are more likely to come from these two gentlemen here, from the opposition research units in particular. They're the main ones that generate those very complex requests.
Now, Nikki, you said that the majority of the requests are actually those fairly benign requests from members of the public. I wasn't aware of that, because the ones that we see are the ones that are being waved around at question time or on the front page of Hayden's paper. Which would suggest perhaps that the Act is functioning as intended in that respect, because it was intended as a piece of legislation for ordinary people to use, wasn't it?
It was intended for all people, but it was also intended for some other things, particularly holding officials and politicians accountable and allowing the public to be involved in the making of laws before they happen. And those are the political issues where it gets difficult. And that, which is almost like its primary aim and is stated at the beginning of the Act, is where we have our trouble, because it's much easier to politically manage an issue if people don't know what's going on, and you can select the information when it suits you. So if you can release selected information when it suits you, you can keep things secret that don't look so good. And that's the fight that we're up against. And it's an unequal fight. There's a lot more of them stopping it than there are of us trying to dig it out.
And increasingly so. Hayden, you mentioned the tactic of spoiling the scoop by dropping the information on everyone's desk. Are there any other things you come up with when you see agencies being obstructed?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the trick of the day at the moment is to just delay. Just say, You could ring up with any old question and they'll say, okay, we need that in writing, we'll treat that as an Official Information Act request, and suddenly 20 days later they say, no, you can't have it. 20 days is wasted. The other tactic is to just wait right to the end of the 20 days, ask for another extension, come back with a denial, which you then have to take to the Ombudsman. All these things take time, and we're a daily newspaper. Stories move very quickly, and they know that. And once you get the information, the story is sometimes dead.
So the hope is that you'll lose interest, or someone else will get the story and you'll move on.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Now I saw some correspondence that you had over what seemed like an incredibly minor matter, the return of ministerial cars.
Yes.
After the change of government. And you had an extraordinary amount of trouble getting that very simple information out.
Correct.
What was going on there?
Well, it's a symptom of what we're facing on the coalface. We're trying to get information. There is an army of people pushing back, trying to stop it. In this case, it was a very simple matter of Winston Peters' car. Had he returned it, or did he still have it? Simple questions which we put to Internal Affairs. We got run around with it, which prompted my email to the person in question, Colin Feslier, just expressing my disgust in how he treated us. As a result of that, he's now will go down in history as a man. As part of our political roundup every week in the newspaper, we've got an award called the Feslier of the Week, which we give to people who deliberately obfuscate. And he also created the worst thing a comms person could do, and that's become part of the story. And I'm confident that happens every day in every government department. It's just that in this case he got caught out.
How much of the skill of making successful requests is actually establishing a relationship with someone like that? Because they're the people who are going to either stonewall you or give you the information. I mean, do you work on that? Do you have a relationship of trust with officials you're dealing with, or are you the enemy?
Well, it's a mixed bag. I couldn't do my job unless there were piles of people who are supportive, just on the end of a phone, just being helpful. Rather than obstructing my official information requests, they ring up and say, there's a lot of paper here, can we talk over what you want? And so there's lots of people of goodwill involved in this, but if it's something where the minister might be embarrassed, where the government doesn't want it, a different set of people get involved. Old mates of ours from the media, these PR people who see it as their job to obstruct. And that's the area where if there was going to be a reform of the Official Information Act, which there needs to be, it's been 27 years and it's time to upgrade it a bit. It's looking at the tricks that they use, they're well established, and starting to plug up those loopholes. It's overdue.
Well, we can talk a little bit more about that after the break, and we will be back soon with more on the Official Information Act.